Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, partije i pod srcem dita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije. Mir tvojoj sreći vodi i u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem dita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije.
Hãy subscribe cho kênh Ghiền Mì Gõ để không bỏ lỡ
самых до окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, на колени, под колени, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, отдых и на труд. Страна моя родная, на колени, под колени, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Над страной весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, на колени, под колени, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Вся ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea din lege și din sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Din lege și din sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvântul fericire de multe și nu rostit, un drum cătam sub soare, spre țări de bucurii. Dar dacă astăzi mergem spre țări pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. O, câte dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the afternoon, 3 o'clock, almost exactly, the 24th of June, 2024, and I'm coming to you slightly earlier today because I have a prior engagement in the evening time. And we will be focusing today on the various very fraudulent policies of the major parties, Labour, Conservatives, and the rebranded UKIP party, the Nigel Farage vehicle known as Reform. Now, I contended a while ago, actually not that long ago, about last week, that the entire debate around immigration in Britain was essentially a farce and a fraud, and had been really since the 50s. And each decade brings a new farce along, and a new performance is staged by groups of very cynical bourgeois politicians who know very well, or at least the more intelligent of them do, that what they're saying is false and that they will never deliver upon it. But they indulge in it anyway, i.e., drumming up controversies, whipping up tensions, pretending that the cause of the immiseration of the British working class comes from the number of migrants coming into the country. Now, what I want to do is to go through the platforms of the major parties when it comes to the immigration question and show you two things. First of all, how similar they are in actuality, beyond rhetoric, beyond Nigel Farage's melodramatic hand waving, beyond Keir Starmer's exasperated gurgles, beyond Rishi Sunak's faux hardman act. Roughly speaking, very much the same policy is there at the heart of this. And the central contradiction that none of them can overcome, including Farage, is that British capitalism is forever hungry for greater amounts of labour. And Nigel Farage, I think, knows that fairly well. He's pretty well in touch with certain elements of British capitalism. Even this is the case for Farage. He is very much in touch with smaller capital, smaller businesses. And for some of them, of course, they depend upon migrant labour as well. And all the major parties know how the role that so-called illegal labour plays in the economy. But all of them engage in the farce. And so I want to go through each of their so-called solutions to show you how much of a farce that we're dealing with here. So we will begin with the Labour Party. An uninspiring choice, you might think, but unfortunately, they are likely to be the party that actually gets into office at the next election. Now, there's a whole page on the Labour Party website dedicated to their plans and immigration. Half of it, or no, roughly a third of it, in fact, is dedicated towards slagging off the Conservatives, so we can safely ignore that. We then get to what their actual so-called plan is. Now, bear in mind, an election manifesto for a major political party is much like promises made after 10 pints of beer. Basically, it's something that, well, sounds good at the time, but in actual fact, if you try and cash in on that promise afterwards, the person who made it to you most likely does not remember ever having met you. So these are so-called plans that really you can take with a pinch of salt in many respects, but it does set a certain tone. And each of these fraudulent plans feeds into the other in many respects. It's a self-reinforcing circle of lies. So Labour's plan for immigration. Let's start with this. And this is the Labour Party's attempt, by the way, to show that they're in favour of Brexit and various different things associated with it. So let's just do a quick screen share here. So I'm going to share with you this particular horror. You should be able to see that now. All of the reference material used in this particular episode can be found on the Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao forum pages on Telegram. So you can find all the links on there. So here you can see what Labour will do on immigration. Now, if this looks like nebulous bullshit to you, this is because it is. So, point 1. Boost Britain's skills by joining up Whitehall systems to spot and tackle skills shortages so we can fire up skills training. My God, the language they use is really awful. Rather than look overseas to fill skills gaps and end the days of sectors languishing on the shortage of skills lists without a plan to deal with the problem. Okay. So first of all, the promise to basically clean up the Whitehall system to make it more efficient and to tackle skills shortages, the promise to invest more in skills in developing skills of native-born British workers. I can remember this promise being made going all the way back to at least 2001. That's the first election I voted in. And I remember the Conservatives making this promise back then. And together with promises made by both Labour and the Tories about retooling vocational education, we're going to build the skills we need here. We're not going to bring in people from overseas, etc., etc. They made those promises. This was, as I've said before, a so-called debate, a frenzied controversy, I think would be the better word for it, 20 years ago, and similar things came up then. So it's not just the fact that the Whitehall civil service system is horrifically inefficient. Of course, it is in many respects. It's very efficient at certain things, though. It's very efficient at making sure that the biggest British capitalists get what they want out of it. But the idea that the reason why there's a lack of training and development for the British working class, it isn't down to the Whitehall system being crap. It's because the employers don't want to invest in it. This was the problem that they faced just after Brexit, when there were restrictions brought in on the numbers that could come in from the EU states. Suddenly, all the transport companies were moaning about the fact that they were short of lorry drivers, and were always asking for dispensations, and to the new immigration rules, because they hadn't actually trained any. None of the big supermarkets had bothered training new people for years. A lot of the logistics companies that deal with smaller forms of road transport had also not bothered training many people for years, because again they had access to a continent-wide labour pool. So why would they? And again, that came from the fact that British capitalism, the way that it operates, always cuts every single aspect of its internal operations to the bone, meaning training and development schemes got canned years ago in many big businesses, and they just looked to bring in people who already had the skills from elsewhere. So essentially, British capitalism was parasitizing on skills developed by workers in other countries. And just merely getting what the civil service to identify where there are skills gaps isn't going to fill those skills gaps, because you'll have to get the employers to invest in training, which the employers don't want to do and won't do unless they're forced to by legislation, or, and this is the more likely outcome, that eventually the employers basically say, well, we'll do it, but you've got to pay for 90% of it, basically. So this is as a non-solution. It's a talking point. Right, point 2. Reform the points-based immigration system. Bring down migration. We will instruct the Migration Advisory Committee to partner with the other government agencies to ensure joined-up action to deliver the skills needed for growth, including priority sectors for our industrial strategy. Basically, they're just repeating the first point here to a certain extent. We will work to reduce the need for international recruitment, boost per capita growth, and ensure quick responses to changes in the labour market. Again, same thing they said in the first point. I mean, you can see why Nigel Farage wins on this issue, because this is their plan, or this is part of their plan. Their manifesto is a little bit shorter in it, but it basically mainly focuses on setting up a new bureaucratic security body. We'll come to that in just a moment. And then third point, New powers to ban hiring from overseas for employers and recruitment agencies who break employment law, an end to workplace exploitation where migration is used as a way to undercut the terms and conditions of workers here. You know what's not on here? And let's just scroll down to their plan to stop the boats. And we'll come to the boats controversy in a minute. But their plan here is to, here it is, this is the big one, in big, bold, white letters. Labour will launch a new border security command with hundreds of new specialist investigators and counter-terror powers to smash criminal gangs and strengthen our borders. Basically, a new police agency. That's their plan on that. And we'll come to the small boats thing in a moment, because I think that needs to be treated somewhat separately. But this is their big plan. It's basically the same plan that Ed Miliband ran on in 2015. Do you know what's not in here, and what's not mentioned at all in any of Labour's policies on migration? None of it mentions trade union rights and worker organisation. None of it does. It's all about, well, we'll do this bureaucratic tweak here, we'll do this bureaucratic tweak there, we'll set up this new government agency here, we'll ban employers from hiring overseas. Well, how on earth are you going to do that? How are you going to restrict that? In truth, you're going to put an arbitrary number on it? Well, I'm willing to bet that as soon as you do that, employers will deploy their legal teams, the big employers will, to find ways to argue that every piece of recruitment they do from overseas is essential. They can't possibly find the skills in Britain. And of course, they won't want to go through the protracted process of training people. So this, given the way that British capitalism is set up, given the way that both public and private sector are set up, which is that they don't want to invest anything in training. They don't want to build up the skills base available to the organization or corporation domestically. They just want to buy people in, ideally on, in many cases, short-term contracts, and then let them go again. And that's the employment model that the employers want, and is only going to get worse if the employers get their own way. So the so-called Party of Labour, on its immigration plan, where it sort of hints at saying that immigration could be used to undercut the terms and conditions of workers here. So then, if they were serious about that, then they would have a fourth point now, which they don't. But the fourth point would be remove all restrictions on trade union operations and organisation, and encourage and we will put in place legislation that will allow trade unions to set up, at the very least, sector-wide bargaining, meaning we will, as the government, recognise trade union bargaining rights over whole sectors of the economy, which would, of course, they would never do that because the employers would shit a brick if they did. So the one thing that would actually stop or would hinder the relentless downward pressure on wages, which is relaxing or doing away with the anti-trade union laws, allowing greater levels of worker organisation, is the one thing they absolutely will not do. And like I said, British capitalism needs migration for a variety of reasons. It needs large rates of migration into the country. We will come to the overall picture in a moment. But Labour's policy, a smoke and mirrors job, a farce, one bureaucratic agency, and some fiddling around with the law that won't be enforced, which the employers will easily find ways around. That's your Labour Party. So that's the first point. And we will now move to look at our old friends in the Conservative Party, if you remember them. I will just do a screen share for this. This is the Conservative Party manifesto. Congratulations if you're watching this. You're probably one of the few people in the country that's actually looked at it. So, a lot of this is just, again, bullshit, but let's go through it anyway. Talk about that again. We'll handle the small boat thing slightly separately. So here we want to focus on these points here in bold, which you should be able to see. Again, the document is available. It's linked to on the Telegram forum, so you can go on there to read. If you want to read the whole thing, be my guest. It is a work of complete fiction, which of course they're not going to implement because they're going to lose this election by a country mile. The only question is whether Labour get a huge majority or a barely workable one, and you know my view on that. So Again, there's a lot of conflation here, but again, you can actually pick out the truth if you know how to read it. So it keeps going on about stopping the boats. Now, again, the boats in the last year. Let me just find the numbers here. According to the government's own statistics, in terms of the small boats, and this is the thing that Farage keeps going on about. This is the thing that all of them keep screaming about. Oh, it's an invasion, you know. The people arriving over the channel, the so-called English Channel, which is what we call it. The French, I'm sure, call it something else. The people coming over as of mid-June, so just a few days ago, this was recorded by the government. So in the first 6 months of the year, so it was 12,315 people which had crossed the channel inside 6 months, which is a rise on the numbers that came across that way in the previous 4 years. According to, again, this is the government's figures as reported by the BBC. In 2023, around 29,000 people came to Britain via the boat method. Now, bear in mind the number of people coming into the country each year is just over 1 million, according to the statistics that's actually published by the government. So, according to the statistics published by the government, and again, this is all statistics taken from the House of Commons Library, which are taken from the Office of National Statistics. So, in 2023, according to the figures published by the ONS, 1.2 million people migrated into Britain, and 532,000 people migrated out of it again. So there's a net migration figure of 685,000. So that the numbers actually arriving by boat are a drop in the ocean, no pun intended, in comparison to the numbers who arrive here basically through regular transport methods. And they arrive here overwhelmingly for two things, education and work. Now, education is, of course, a big selling point that the British ruling class promoted relentlessly overseas for many, many years. I used to work in this area myself, and they put an awful lot of effort into bringing people over here to either university or college, charging them an enormous amount of money, and then they either stay here or go back, but the idea is that they've contributed a gigantic amount via the fees that they pay to the businesses, and that's what the universities and colleges are here. They are businesses. So this is this is the way that things actually are in terms of the numbers. So the numbers coming across the channel in boats has gone up, and the overwhelming majority of those come from just 4 countries: Sudan, Afghanistan, Iran, and Eritrea, which is not what I expected. But when it comes to at least one of those, Afghanistan was, of course, directly affected by British imperialism for over 40 years, given that the combined policies of British imperialism helped to destroy that country many times over, and then the British were part of an occupying army for 20 years. No surprise that people are leaving there. Iran's been under a huge amount of sanctions, which the British have been fully on board with for many, many years. Sudan, well, of course, the fingerprints of Britain are all over the very creation of Sudan in the first place, and the British have been messing around in there for a number of decades. Eritrea is a bit of an odd one. I need to do more research into that. But the other thing is, like the point about it is that the small boat numbers are indeed very, very small, and they mostly come from countries which are dirt poor and are where life there is being made for many people unbearable in some cases, thanks to the actions of British imperialism. Now, one thing that is not mentioned in either the Tory, Labour, or Reform manifestos — I haven't bothered with the Liberals because they're irrelevant — is that, of course, each of these parties, depending upon the constituency they're aiming for, only gets agitated about immigration numbers when it suits the particular agenda that they're working towards. So, for instance, Nigel Farage's mob did raise an issue about the 100,000 odd at least Ukrainians coming here, but they were all in favour of, or at least didn't speak out too much about, the fact that an equal number arrived from Hong Kong a few years earlier. Because, of course, Nigel Farage and his crew were visceral anti-communist, anti-China characters who were all, many of them anyway, were on board with the regime change operation, or the Colour Revolution operation that the British were helping to run in Hong Kong. So again, when big numbers arrive, it's not always a matter of political controversy. It depends upon the expediency. Is it a politically expedient measure to support this wave of migration or not? And when it comes to the basically Hong Kong and Ukraine, where they're the biggest, or two of the biggest single contributors to the numbers coming over the last few years, all the major political parties, other than Farage's gang, whatever they're calling themselves at any given time, have all been on board with that. So moving back to the Conservative Manifesto then. So they're going on about their Great Rwanda policy, which is essentially giving Paul Kagame some slave labor that he can use. So they're saying they will do the following. Establish a deterrent. First of all, though, notice that they're leading with the illegal migration thing. But again, the great bulk of that over 1 million people who arrive each year arrive perfectly legally to do work or study. And again, even Farage acknowledges that. And we'll get into more details about that in just a moment. So the Tories, this is all a PR act, by the way. Overwhelmingly, it's a PR act. But it does have damaging consequences. Do they say they're going to establish a deterrent? We will run a relentless and continual process of permanently removing illegal migrants to Rwanda with a regular rhythm of flights. Odd choice in language. Every month starting this July until the boats are stopped. If we are forced to choose between our security and the jurisdiction of a foreign court, including the ECHR, that's the European Court of Human Rights, and European Convention on Human Rights, we will always choose our security. This is largely a farce. The Rwanda flight scheme was never serious policy. I believe it's sent about one person so far. And it was brought in by a government that is on its last legs. It was a desperate PR stunt. And Paul Kagame just looked at it and went, oh, give me some money and I'll go along with it. And they gave him a load of money. It's not going to get off the ground. Starmer's going to drop it for a variety of reasons I'll get to in just a moment. So this is a farce. It's always the idea that you could do this and this would be the deterrent. Bear in mind what a lot of these people are running from. Some of the other groups that are arriving in the small boats are, of course, Syrians and Libyans. So they're already coming from countries we've turned into a war-torn hellhole. And they're coming here, basically, so they can find some work, any work. They're not coming here to sit on benefits. That's a lie. Because if you're coming here illegally, you can't go and sit on the benefits system. I mean, I've met people in my travels over the years who actually came here and slipped under the radar and picked up some illegal work, so-called, for a number of months and then went home again. Because they're, again, due to the vast differentials in currency and the value of it, if you get work for a few months, even illegally, it's actually better than whatever the hell it is you can get back home quite a lot of the time. So again, this isn't going to deter anybody. They're coming here because they've already reached the point of desperation, those in the boats, that is. They're coming here because their country's already been turned into a complete ruin, often by British and US imperialism, quite a lot of the time. So this isn't going to do anything. You can't stop people who are already desperate from trying to seek a way out of their desperate situation. And of course, the big reason that they're coming here is because they know the work's here. They know the work's here. They know that if they come in, they can find some kind of job, even in the, shall we say, the illegal labor market. They know that there's employers out there who will do it. Often they come here and find work within a few days if they manage to get in, get off the boat, and get into the cities. Can find work fairly easily. So again, this is a farce. This is a PR move, an expensive PR move. It's a complete joke, come up with by a government that's just out of ideas and out of time. They then go on about, we will end the legal merry-go-round. We will stop illegal migrants from bringing spurious challenges to block their removal by bringing our Illegal Migration Act into force and clearing the asylum backlog with all claims processed in 6 months and the use of hotels ended. Well, the reason why they're using hotels to house these people is because essentially they've run out of space in the detention camps that were built by successive governments over the years. They've got so many of these people chucked into camps now that they started using the hotel system, especially when people were going through appeals. So again, this is a product. The reason why the legal system has become so inefficient also is because the Tories cut the legal system to pieces in terms of its budgets. So you ended up with backlogs, not just in the asylum, those dealing with asylum and migration claims, but even in like the civil and criminal courts, there's huge backlogs because the Tories cut all the resources from them. So they're now saying they're going to solve a problem that they created. Again, these aren't serious people. Crackdown on organised immigration crime. Again, this is the big myth that they keep going on about. Yes, there are criminal gangs that do smuggle people into Britain. But that's not how most people are arriving. And again, this is not broken down and explained in when this so-called debate is put on the bourgeois press. Whether it's the bourgeois press that is openly liberal or the bourgeois press that is openly reactionary, all of these different categories are conflated together. So those who come seeking actual asylum who are fleeing persecution, those who come seeking work, any work that they can get, who might come on a boat but might be not looking to go into the system, but might be just looking for any work that they can get, those who arrive to study, those who arrive to work through the pre-established legal route, all of that by all of these sides that are supposedly debating this is all thrown in together. And what they aim to do, really, if one takes a cynical view of the way this is presented, what they aim to do is to just make people as incoherently angry as possible so that they can be easily bamboozled into agreeing to anything. That's the purpose for this debate. They then go on at further length, reform asylum rules, holding an international summit and working with other countries to reform international laws to make them fit for an age of mass migration. We will restrict visa access from countries that don't work with us and our national priorities, like illegal migration. Well, look, this is again a farce, because they go and contradict themselves on this in the next section. Basically, again, this is fluff, meaningless nonsense. They'll get together and they'll say with France, or they'll get together and they'll say with various different British allies that stopping illegal migration is really important to us. By the way, have you got any workers we can take? Return people with no right to be here to their own country. We will sign further returns deals like the one we already have agreed with Albania. Again, like the reason why people stick around quite a lot of the time is because they can, even if their claim is denied and they're looking at being chucked out, a lot of the time, if they're able to just walk out of the place that they've been staying in, they can just disappear into the ether and get work somewhere. And again, the Tories have no interest in stopping that, because again, that would mean clamping down severely on business. And the Tories are pathologically averse to that. They are the party of capital, after all. Labour's not going to do it either. Labour will pretend they're going to do it and then not do it. And then they say they throw in a bit for the Liberals at the end. With control of our borders, we can do more to help refugees fleeing persecution. Here comes the 1-2 punch. In addition to maintaining visa schemes for people fleeing Hong Kong, Ukraine, and our Afghan settlement schemes. Well, I wonder why people would be fleeing to free of those. I wonder what the record of the British government is in all of those countries. Hong Kong, we pushed a bunch of people who, for some reason, which it's too long to go into now, had still sort of, had basically been enrolled in a British-sponsored colour revolution project, which went wrong, and then we basically offered to take them in when they fled, as it went to shit. Ukraine, well, we've covered that extensively, the British government's role in turning that country into a hellhole. And Afghanistan, well, we've already mentioned that, and the British government played an active part in occupying it for 20 years and empowering warlords there. And before that, we were empowering Islamic fundamentalists to destroy the socialist government there. And again, you put the numbers who have come in via the schemes run for Hong Kong and Ukraine especially, it dwarfs the number that are coming in via the small boats. Absolutely dwarfs it. So why the focus on the small boats? Again, like you need to unpack this in a way that the bourgeois press don't. If the numbers of people, they don't mention the numbers here, who have come in via the schemes run for people from Hong Kong and Ukraine, and to a certain extent Afghanistan, but I don't think they've been allowed in anything like the same numbers. But let's just take the Hong Kong and Ukraine schemes. It's over nearly 20 times the number that comes in via the small boats. So what's the actual issue? Because it's clearly not the numbers that the Tories are bothered about, because in actual fact, the Tories aren't bothered about the immigration situation. Again, it's a manipulation. If you look at the fact that the schemes that they run to bring people in bring in far more than are supposedly coming in via the boats, then the boats thing is clearly not an issue. If it's just about numbers, then the boats issue isn't what is depressing wages and making people not be able to get council housing or any of the other things that Mr. Farage, will come to him in a moment, insists is the central reason for all of Britain's problems. So it's clearly not about the numbers. It's about expediency. This is all a manipulation. So here we get to where they start telling more of the truth, though, and this is why I'm going to read this bit as well. They headline this section, delivering sustainable levels of high-skilled migration. So here is where they're going to tell a little bit more of the truth to you. Immigration is too high. Well, they don't actually think it is. We want to attract the brightest and best skilled migrants to the UK to contribute to our businesses and public services. We must bring migration numbers down to sustainable levels. Well, actually, they are at sustainable levels, in truth. To reduce the impacts on public services and housing and to restore public confidence in the system. The idea that the migration levels are what is causing the public sector and public services and housing to be in short supply, or the public services to be overstretched, that's just a categorical lie. We will come to the reasons for that just in a moment. So they then go on about what they're going to do, and they go to some adjustments they say they're going to make, but they do keep saying, we will continue to attract the brightest and best students to study in our world-class institutions. So in other words, bear in mind what we said earlier about the actual numbers coming through education. So the biggest numbers coming into Britain are coming in for the purposes of study. And that's the case for quite a number of years now, and that's a crucial part of the business model. So the numbers coming into Britain for study dwarf those coming in for work or family reasons. In fact, the number coming in for family reasons remains pretty much level. Numbers coming in for work has gone up, as has the numbers coming in from non-EU countries. See, what happened was when Britain left the EU, the actual migration level shifted somewhat, which is that EU migration went down. See, EU migration was running above non-EU migration for the years between roughly 2012 to 2018. And then it just craters after Brexit gets, well, partially at least done. And then the numbers of non-EU migration, the non-EU migration numbers spike at that point, because all the EU migration just gets replaced by non-EU migration. And you actually end up with more non-EU migration coming in after Brexit. So again, like, this was always going to happen, because at the end, the labour demand is still there. So the labour demand, which suddenly that they couldn't more that they found more difficult to bring in from that giant labour market that stretched all the way from Ireland to Poland and down to Greece and all the way through the Mediterranean. All that was replaced with non-EU labour, which shoots up after 2019. So this, by the way, anybody could have told you with half a brain looking at the British economy that that was going to happen. Capital would make the demand for more migrant labour and more would arrive. I remember Tory government ministers going around like Liz Truss, remember her? Dr. Fox, the incredibly corrupt former defence minister, who was a trade envoy for a while. They were going around a few short years ago, saying that, well, we're not opposed to migration. Brexit's not about stopping migration. We're just going to get people to migrate in whose skills we need from different countries. So increasing non-EU migration was their plan, because again, capital's demands must be satisfied. So they then turn round, and for various reasons, partly because I would actually not mainly because British capitalism is in such a crisis, they've basically wheeled out the immigration issue again and started banging the drum over it, because they need people to be to have their justifiable anger over their declining wages and the declining public services and the long wait for any kind of decent public housing, which is an incredibly long wait, or the completely unaffordable nature of private housing in the country. They need that anger diverted somewhere, and that anger gets diverted into the immigration question. So they are specifically saying, the Tories are, and I'll stop sharing that now, they are specifically saying that the policy will remain roughly the same. That they are still going to be looking to essentially scalp other countries' skilled workers, that the demands of capital for already trained workers to come in and fill gaps here will continue. That's what the Tory plan is there for. The Labour Party says that they'll address it and they will stop the over-reliance on workers from overseas. I don't believe that for a second. When Labour were in office last time, the investment in building skills in this country went down, and there's no reason to believe that British capitalism will actually improve its record on that if the Labour Party gets in. If anything, Labour will end up with roughly the same policies that the Tories I've just outlined to you there from the Tories. But now we go to the big one, which is, of course, our old friend Nigel Farage, promoted heavily by certain other YouTube channels in the belief that he is some sort of messiah. Now this is what I'm going to share to you now. The Reform Manifesto, I will say this for it, it is mercifully short. But I'll also say this, Reform was led for years, and again is still heavily influenced by a man named Richard Tice. Richard Tice is a property magnate and a multi-millionaire. He's made his millions through dealing in property. And so what you're about to hear from Reform with regard to what the causes of the housing crises are is, of course, not only a lie, it's a lie that is laid bare by their former leaders and probably future leaders as well, own record in business. So they begin. Now, the real difference between the Labour Party, the Tories and Reform is in the bluntness of the language used. So let's continue. Uncontrolled immigration has pushed Britain to breaking point, says Nigel Farage and co. Reform UK, that's the current brand name they're using, will secure Britain's borders, protect wages. If you believe that the likes of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are in this to protect the wages of British workers, then I have some magic beans, a magic lamp and a bridge to sell you. They will protect our public services. Well, the rest of their manifesto very much says the opposite of that. And British culture and values. No one's ever really managed to define for me what the shared culture and values of this country are. There's a lot of British culture and there are numerous values that are more common in Britain than elsewhere. But I very much doubt that me and Richard Tice share much culture in common. I've probably been to some of the same pubs as Nigel Farage. I will give him that. shared culture is much more to do with it's much more a combination of class and nation than it is just nation. Like the idea that the people in the working class areas of Greater Manchester share a common culture with the bourgeoisie, it's laughable. It really is. Having moved to a certain extent in both circles, the idea that we have much in common with the ruling class at all is a joke. They just live in a completely different world. You have far more in common with the guy who's just got off the plane or got off the boat, and wherever he or she might have come from. So anyway, they say they're going to do critical reforms in the first 100 days. By the way, reform aren't going to get into government unless there's a bizarre quirk in the election and you end up with a Conservative Reform Party administration coalition, which is the least likely outcome. The likelihood is they are going to pick up a number of votes for reasons I've gone into before. They are probably going to get about between 4 and 5 million. But that doesn't necessarily translate into seats due to the way in which the British electoral system is organised via the constituency first past the post system. So, first 100 days, freeze non-essential immigration. Note the phrase non-essential. Strict limits on immigration are the only way to relieve the pressure on our housing, public services, on the pressure on our housing, public services, increase wages, protect our cultural identity and values. Essential skills, mainly around healthcare, must be the only exception. Right, so I can guarantee you that this, even if they got into office tomorrow, that they wouldn't implement this for reasons we've been through already. And let's deal with the lies one at a time. The housing crisis is not due to immigration. Again, like the net migration into the UK over the course of the last 12 months is just over 600,000. That's not the reason why there's a housing crisis in this country. To give you an indication of what one of the causes of the housing crisis is in this country, according to the House of Commons Library, there are 676,304 empty homes recorded just in England. So that doesn't include Wales or Scotland. We're not dealing with the occupied 6 counties of Ireland because I don't consider it to be part of Britain. So let's read that to you again, and I'm going to give you the full quote, and this is from House of Commons Library Parliamentary Research Briefings. The local government department published data on empty homes as classed for council tax purposes. In October 2022, so this is nearly 2 years old now, there were 676,304 recorded empty homes in Britain. This is a 3.6% increase on the previous year's total. 248,149 were classed as long-term vacant properties, which is vacant for more than 6 months. So we have the same number of empty properties in this country as there were people as there were roughly people who arrived via the net migration figures in the country in the last year. So again, like it's clearly the case that it's not that we don't have the homes, it's just that we've got 670 odd thousand of them standing empty. That's part of the problem. Now, what you should do, of course, is if somebody owns a place and it's been empty for, let's say, over 6 months and they don't plan to do anything with it, then clearly they're not using it for whatever reason, and the government should seize it and nationalise the stock. In fact, for all of those empty places, the government should nationalise the entire stock and then start to apportion it on the basis of need. That's what you should do. Of course, Nigel and Richard aren't interested in doing that because Nigel and Richard are a pair of a property developer and a finance guy. They're not interested in that. They're interested in getting angry working class people to put their anger in the wrong place. So when they talk about a housing crisis, bear in mind that statistic. 676,000 empty homes in this country, 270,000 or so of them empty for more than 6 months. So the other, of course, problem, the pressure on housing is because the British government pushed housing development purely into the realm of the private sector a long time ago. For the longest time, they severely restricted, or in some cases of some local authorities, stopped building public housing entirely. In Britain, we call it council housing. And everybody was pushed towards the private ownership model from the 80s onwards. And so where you have little or no public options and everybody is pushed towards the private market, what you're going to end up with is people who just can't afford to live anywhere. They can't afford, due to the fact they're low waged, to get accepted into the private market. there was that period prior to 2008 when they were offering a mortgage to anybody who turned up and maybe worked for 1 hour a week. That period's gone. They're trying desperately to bring it back. They're trying desperately to relax conditions on who can get a mortgage. But again, the housing crisis, the reason why people are on waiting lists, the reason why people are sleeping in converted shipping containers and converted offices, is because there's a gigantic number of working class people in Britain who work full time but don't earn enough to live on. And so they can't get on the so-called housing ladder, which again is a fake solution anyway for most people. And they can't get access to public housing because there's too little of it. And so they end up sleeping permanently in like temporary accommodation, which is no good for raising children in. And there's a lot of people who now who have young children who end up sleeping in temporary accommodation. The essence of the crisis, the center of the crisis, is the preferential treatment that the private housing developments get from the government. And given that Richard Tice, the man who helped found this party, has directly profited from government housing policy, he doesn't have any motivation to change it, and his class don't either. So the idea that it's immigration putting the pressure on housing supply, that's just a straight up lie. It's a very simple, easily disproven lie, but nobody will, of course, put that to Farage. Because again, Farage is being promoted as the fake alternative. And if you can't spot that, you've probably had quite a severe blow to the head. So again, the public services thing, I mean, that's another, the pressure on public services comes from not only cut budgets, but the fact that things like the NHS have been beggared by debt that's been loaded onto it by both Labour and Tory administrations, and the fact that the public sector is used to essentially funnel money out of it into the pockets of private sector companies, and more specifically, the directors of private sector companies. That's the reason why the public services have been under strain. And as for depressed wages, and here we will draw on government statistics again, like the wages in Britain started being systematically depressed, funnily enough, in around about 1980, which is when real wage growth slowed down. According to various different bits of research, so real wage growth was around about 2% in the 1980s, and in the 1990s went down to around about 1.5%, and then collapsed completely after 2008. And again, this is data that you can find on the Office of National Statistics website. In fact, I'm going to flip the screen share here so you can see what I am looking at. You should be able to see that now. So you can see here, this is from the Office of National Statistics. Wage growth spikes when, of course, there is there's a crisis in the economy, and also there's a record level of trade union strength, so mid to late 70s. Wage growth, real wage growth, and salary growth starts to go down then when the Tories get in, and then when the working classes organisations are smashed. There's some uptick there towards the end of the 80s, but the trend since, look where the trend starts to go drastically down again. It happens to be the collapse of the socialist systems. So, spike there. At that point, 1980, there's just over 13 million people organised in trade unions in this country, which, again, I have outlined many times, as have my comrades in the Class Consciousness Project, the severe problems that trade union organisation has. But the fact is that in terms of working class bargaining power, the 60s and 70s were the high point. So working class bargaining power drops, and then working class bargaining power drops again following the counter-revolutions in the old socialist bloc. Then we see real wages go down. We see a slight recovery towards the end of the 90s, but the trend, the general line, is downward. As we can see here, it drops off a cliff when 2007, and has never recovered since then. So immigration is not the reason why wages are depressed and suppressed in this country. The general trend has been downwards ever since the late 1970s. Ever since, of course, Margaret Thatcher, who Nigel Farage loves and reveres as a demigod, as he should. He probably did quite well out of that period, as did many of the smaller capitalists, even if they did later fall out with the larger capitalists over the fact that they worked out that the larger capitalists were really weren't in the same struggle that they were in. But the general trend is down since 1979. The general trend is down because working class bargaining power has been systematically reduced. And if you want to redress that, then, well, someone should say to Nigel, well then, Nigel, why don't you remove all restrictions on trade union activity then? If you want, given that wages were consistently improving when working class bargaining power was much higher, and have collapsed since working class bargaining power was destroyed, first by anti-trade union legislation and deindustrialization, then by the socialist bloc's collapse. Well then, Nigel, perhaps you'd like to remove all the anti-trade union laws. No? Didn't think so. In which case, you're full of shit, which he absolutely is. We move back then to old Nige and Richard. Nige and Dickie's great big immigration bonanza. So they say, same thing as the Tories and Labour Party say. They say that they'll securely detain all illegal migrants. Again, this has been something which has gone back and forth for years. Basically, what it means is they're going to build more prisons. And the prisons are always there. The detention centres are always there to do what? By the way, Nigel Farage and Richard Tice and the other reform clowns, they're not going to stop so-called illegal immigration any more than the Labour Party are or the Tories are. They're going to do a Maloney. If they got into government, if there was a turn up for the books and Nigel Farage became Prime Minister by the end of next week, which is when the election is, he would do a Maloney. Because the capitalists would come to him and say, well, look, Nige, bit of a problem here, old chap. You had this manifesto thing, which is very nice. I mean, I did enjoy reading it. But the fact is, unless we bring in this amount of labour, we're fucked. And we need you to be a good boy and do what you're told. Because he would buckle to that, just the same way his friend in Italy has, just the same way his friend in France will, Le Pen. Because, again, Nigel Farage isn't going to buck the trend and defy the will of British capitalism, is he? Of course he's not. So the rest of this is basically propaganda and bullshit. So immediate deportation for foreign criminals. Again, Tories and Labour have both said the same thing for years. The reason why a lot of the cases get jammed up is because the system's horrifically inefficient, and none of them are really going to actually improve that, because nobody wants to invest serious resources in the court system. Bar student dependence, well, they might do this, but then again, the universities will probably start complaining to him if Prime Minister Farage became a reality and say, well, look, Nige, unless we allow them to bring the dependents with them, a lot of people aren't going to come over here and spend millions of pounds on our amazing education system. The health tourism thing is a chimera. It's an illusion. There's very little, and by the way, they keep conflating. They say that illegal immigrants get immediate access to benefits. That's just simply not true. Certain people do if they get awarded asylum, and if they're found to have a case to be made that they're fleeing, legitimately fleeing persecution. That's who gets access to it. Farage and co, and not just them, but the entire media always conflate all the different categories of migration to create one hate figure in the mind of the angry working class or middle class person, which is the figure of the immigrant who comes over here on a boat with a bunch of military age men, jumps off the boat, runs up to the DWP and say, hello, I would like some benefits, please. And while you're at it, where are the white women? You know, it's the usual scaremongering garbage, basically. The fact is that people who are working class people who are angry about this, if you actually talk to them, what they're angry about is wage restrictions, is the fact that they or their children can't get housing or decent housing, that the public services in their communities have been withdrawn or have fallen to pieces, that they've had bad experiences using the public services, either the education system or the health system, that the schools are oversubscribed, and they have a lot of class-based anger, and it's very legitimate. The whole immigration thing is designed to push that into areas where it's less harmful for capital. Because if people started to organise around these class-based issues, then it would be potentially dangerous for capital. Best get them angry about a distraction, about something which isn't actually the cause of many of these things, and push them towards that. And of course, all of the pro-capitalist parties are really happy to continue to bang this drum. And Nigel Farage plays the game better than anybody else, because whereas you notice with the Tories and the Labour Party, they had to keep hedging and saying, oh, well, we still need this number of migrants, though, well, we still need this amount of skilled labour from over here. Even Nigel actually goes towards that when he puts in that phrase about non-essential. Non-essential, is a very, or essential, is a very stretchy term. You can cover almost anything with it. So again, these are issues which are put in front of you to make sure that you get angry, but you don't get angry about the right thing. If you are really concerned about wages, then again, remove all the restrictions on trade union activity. Of course, not going to do that, are they? Final thing, and another gimmick, employer immigration tax. The national insurance rate will be raised to 20% for foreign workers. This would incentivize businesses to employ British citizens whose national insurance rate would stay at 13.8%. Essential foreign health and care workers will be exempt from the tax, as will businesses who employ 5 staff members and under, so small business. This would boost wages. That's a very dubious claim, and could raise more than 20 billion over 5 years to pay for apprenticeships and training for young Brits. Again, this is a garbage policy that they would never bring in the way that they're talking about here. And the idea that this would automatically lead to an increase in the employment of British citizens, only British citizens, again, dubious at best. Given that, again, the great majority of people who come into the country are coming in to either work or study, and work here perfectly legally, often in low wage jobs which are in similar conditions or the same conditions as a British national would get anyway. So there are the people who work in the illegal labour market, who do like the dirtiest, nastiest jobs. Those people are a crucial part of the profits of the agricultural sector, for instance. So those are the people that are doing the jobs that are in the illegal labour market. Most of the rest, though, that come in, they're doing jobs that are on the same terms and conditions as British nationals. They're all low-wage jobs, but Britain's a low-wage country and has been for many, many years. Low-wage sectors are the only growth sectors in the economy, really, that most people have access to. So again, like through conflation, they're creating this idea that the foreign worker comes over here and works on drastically different terms and conditions in the same job. That's not true. So the illegal, those who are working in what's called the illegal labour market will be working in significantly worse terms and conditions. For a lot of the time, though, the migrant labourers and the native-born British are working in the same job on the same shit conditions. And the actual motivating point for capital is to make sure that the shit conditions remain in place and get worse, because the only way British capitalism can properly restore profit is to reduce everybody's terms and conditions as far down as possible, which is why they need the part of the reason why they need the not uncontrolled but large amounts of migration that Nigel Farage is complaining about here. That the part of the reason they need it is because, again, they need more people to fill out these growth sectors in the economy, but they're what they'd actually quite like is for, well, they're not fussed about who does this. They would like the more British workers to accept the worst terms and conditions. The reason why you bring in a lot of migrants to work in the care sector is that the terms and conditions there are awful. So you only end up with the poorest end of the working class, the native-born working class in there, and people who have recently arrived who are prepared to do that job in those terrible terms and conditions. But you can get a job on those terms and conditions as a native-born Brit if you want, and an increasing number do. The plan is to bring down the terms and conditions of everybody, and that's a plan that I'm sure Nigel Farage would absolutely agree with, given his class position. So all of this is essentially a large farce. What the Reform Party puts forward is essentially a slightly more aggressively worded version of what the Tory party is putting forward. And what the Labour Party is putting forward is, because they're much more even more the party of capital now than even the Conservatives are, is essentially a programme that is approved by British business. And when you come down to it, if you cut through all the lies and all the bullshit, what it all comes down to is two things. One, that they're going to put more securitization in place. That is something that will happen. And two, that they're not going to stop migration, because again, they need migration for the purposes of employing people in more hyper exploitable circumstances, but also because without continual waves of migration, the actual labour force in this country wouldn't be the size that it is, and they couldn't afford to keep the pensions or the benefits system going. As comrades of mine who have written articles on this recently, including my comrade Jyoti Brar, point out, the benefits and pension system in Britain are essentially they're now that they are Ponzi schemes. They pay out at one end and come in at another. The idea is that you're saving for your retirement. This isn't true. Like, you're putting in now so that someone at the other end can take out. And you better hope that someone's going to come in after you to put something in, because if not, then there's going to be nothing there for you. So it's long since been a Ponzi scheme. And without continued waves of migration, then the system will collapse. Then you've got serious unrest on your hands. So, and again, they all know this. Nigel Farage knows this as well. He's not a stupid man. Richard Tice might be, but Farage isn't stupid. That's why a lot of this stuff, it portrays itself as straight talking. But of course, he can do that at the moment because he's not in any risk of getting into power. Were he getting into power, he would Maloney it in a second. Because again, he would bend to the demands of capital, as they all do. These big, tough right-wing guys all bend to the demands of capital. What he would do is then he'd stage several dramatic shows of force about deportations, whip up a bit more racism, probably against Arabs or people from West Asia in general, people from North Africa, and at the same time make sure the migrant numbers keep coming in. This is all about the demands of capital. All of these parties are engaging in a farce with the bourgeois press whipping it up time and time again. And again, I will repeat what I've said before. Various Home Secretaries, people like David Blunkett and others, have admitted when they're safely out of office and ensconced in the House of Lords that the whole thing was a dance. The whole thing was designed to whip up emotion, to divert frustration, to stop people looking at things through a class lens and get them to look at it through a racialized lens. Because if you can do that, you can continue ripping everybody off. You can continue to make public services worse. You can continue to push down on wages, and you keep screaming about immigration, immigration, immigration. And Farage is just putting forward like a slightly more amped up version of what the Tories are putting forward. The next generation of purebred reactionaries will put forward something which is even more, which will be more openly racist than this is, and so therefore we evolve further down the line towards open fascism. And open fascism in this country will be dedicated to doing, well, principally one thing: smashing the living standards of the working class and making sure that the capital is able to employ native-born Brits in a profitable way again. But for the native-born British worker, it won't be much of a party, given that his or her living standards will be driven down to poverty levels, and they'll be employed by the capitalists with the barrel of a gun wielded by the state at the back of their heads. Right. Okay. We have a lot of comments coming in. We have 250 of you watching. Right. So let's go through. Hello to Felipe. Hello, Paul Mason, who says, contemplating a research visit to Pyongyang. Would this be a worthwhile excursion? Absolutely, Paul. If you're watching, I hope you are. And while you're there, why don't you take some copies of your most recent book and your writings on the DPRK and try and distribute them openly in the streets and see what happens. Greetings to Albert, who says, workers of the world unite. Indeed. Kevin joins us from Sligo. Two Sugars is with us, who says, how convenient for Washington that ISIS have decided to attack the same country the US bombs are falling on. Very true. We have James Goblin joining us from the once and future Yugoslavia. Albert says, I'm on a course on World War One. The presenter claims World War One was an accident. I've heard that before. Isn't it's surprising that the Libyan War was also an accident, along with Afghanistan and Iraq? Well, as you say yourself, Albert, in a later comment, there's whole books dedicated to the idea that the British acquired an empire by accident. Oh, we just woke up one morning and it turns out we'd taken over all of India. It's funny how it works out, isn't it? Anything to deny responsibility. We have Dylan with us, not far from Port Talbot. We are still reeling about the steelworks here. Yes, and if the Labour Party were worth anything, they would have pledged to fully nationalise the steel industry in order to preserve it and reinvest in it, which of course they haven't done. But Unite's given them the money anyway. It's great. Yes, Two Sugars, it is me singing all of the songs. I have that degree of larynx flexibility. Jerry joins us from the warm and sunny climes of Hampshire. Christopher Rogers is joining us from the South China Sea. Are you doing pirate radio? We have Nikolai joins us and says, Tavarish, and I say it back to you. Jillian enjoyed the Romanian version of the Marseillaise. Michael is imagining me doing Soviet songs on stage. Well, if I could learn Russian better, I would do. President Jesus is with us from the perpetual dictatorship of Gavin Newsom. Jerry, I deny your allegation that I was rapping at May Day. This is not a man who you need to see doing a Vanilla Ice routine, no matter if it is infused with Marxism. Beju, good afternoon to you, comrade. Working Prole Inc. joins us and says, oi, folks. I wave back at you. Bernardo Bender is with us. Yu Wan joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Tom Joad says, Labour the continuity neoliberals. Otis is with us. Arnold joins us and says, seaside towns are the most racist. Here in Bridlington, he remarks on a daily basis that wouldn't be out of place in the Third Reich. Well, to be honest, the cities are not that much better. Depends upon where you are. The thing I've always found with people who are racist is that, or who have like racist opinions, is that you find these days that they'll be racist about people who are outside of their immediate orbit, but they'll work around loads of people who are like black or black Caribbean or Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and they'll know loads of people who are non-white. But then they'll say something racist about those other people who are coming over here. People are very funny, and like the racism can disappear quite quickly when genuine movements of the working class get built. It gets overcome and left behind quite quickly. It's annoying to hear it, but it's also, it gets dispelled quite quickly in times of struggle. Tom Job makes the correct point that Labour won't repeal the anti-trade union legislation. More time needed, says early 2000s the plan was a high-skilled, high-pay economy. Well, that never happened. Wages have stagnated since then. That was never the plan. I know that's what they said the plan was. That was all the publicity. We're going to be a knowledge economy, but the actual reality was that the growth sectors were always in low-paid, low-skill jobs, and that's the only growth sectors that have continued to be growth sectors ever since then. And the government, as I said before, underwrites low wages and has done for years. President Jesus says, is stop the boats the British equivalent of build the wall? Yes, it is. It's in other words, it's something which it's an emotive phrase, which is never actually going to happen. Two Sugars says, funny thing is, Labour and Conservatives are not promising anything, and it's still not fully costed, which makes me suspicious they'll get funding from private equity. The things that will happen are like Labour's additional policing and securitization measures. They'll happen. A lot of the other stuff won't. Comradely greetings from Moscow, from Svetlana. Hello to you. Arnold says, British jobs for British workers, Gordon Brown. Yeah, another cynical phrase, never meant to be taken seriously. Landline says, vote for me because my lies are less insulting than the others. I think they're all pretty insulting, to be honest. The French call the English channel La Manche, says Irish Partisan, joining us from Minsk. Hello to you. Albert, all capitalist education leaves an awful lot to be desired, and that's by design. Spurious Furious joins us from Vancouver Island. Sean joins us from Plymouth. Jerry says, I understand the hotel chains were glad of the income from immigration. Yeah, they make a lot of money from housing people for the government, not just from immigration, but from homelessness and mental health services as well. Svetlana asks, will mass migration usher socialism sooner in the UK or delay its realization? Neither. Look, there could have been conceivably socialist revolutions at a couple of points, I would argue, since 1945. One was the 1945 period itself. There was a long period of very bitter class struggle between 68 and 85. And in the early period of that, revolutionary movements could have been built had there been a communist party worthy of the name. So it's not a question of migration. I mean, the migration question, it has mattered in terms of being used as the dividing line by the ruling class over the last 25 years or last 30 years, because working class organizations have been so weak. It's not the question of whether migration is large or small that will affect our ability to go towards socialism. It is the organization of the communists and the class consciousness of the working class. Those are the two decisive factors. And can we overcome the barriers to realizing these things? Is there a historic precedent for Marxist parties holding any position on migration? Well, there is. It's become more of a thing, though, in the imperial core nations since the 80s. In other words, since the working class suffered defeats and since the socialist bloc collapsed and the ruling class were able to draw on labour pools from, again, all the way across Europe and much more broadly than that, it's become a thing. But I think my own party's got the most sensible approach to it, which is to say quite simply that, as I've been saying, that this whole thing is a cruel farce. And also, do you really expect, and this is mainly directed at the Social Democrats, do you really expect that a government which wages class war relentlessly on the working class is going to actually enact legislation that benefits the working class on immigration or anything else? The answer's no. The answer's no. The only thing that the immigration laws do reliably is to cause division and ramp up racism. That's what they're really designed to do. They're designed to keep the working class divided and weak. That's what they're there to do. And so demanding more immigration laws in this country is akin to demanding that more petrol be poured on your own bonfire. Because, again, you're asking an intrinsically hostile force, the British capitalist state, to suddenly act in favor of the working class. Like, you saw those manifestos there, all of which are shrouded in bullshit. The reform one stands out because its language is a bit more blunt, but it's full of shit. And you actually believe that the arseholes that run the Reform Party are interested in higher wages for workers, or anybody else who preaches that restrictions on migration will lead to higher pay for workers? They won't. The reason why wages are low is because working class bargaining power got destroyed 40 years ago and weakened further 30 years ago. And it's not going to be suddenly improved by the capitalist state suddenly deciding that it's going to restrict migration. Because firstly, it's not going to do that. And even if it did, that would come with a further assault on workers' wages, because that's just the way those are the demands of capital. Anybody who's actually interested in solving these problems, or at least putting forward a program that would inspire a real improvement in the bargaining position of the working class, would be talking non-stop about removing all restrictions on trade unionism. That's what they would be talking about. This idea that, oh, well, we stop this bit of immigration, or we restrict this here, or we would cut it off entirely. Suddenly the working class benefits from that. That's a cruel lie that social democrats and fascists both engage in. But then again, the social democrat and the fascist are very much interrelated. Jerry says, this sounds paranoid, but I've heard they are bringing in young men to serve in the army on the grounds that those from abroad are less restrained about attacking us when we riot. I've heard that before. I don't think that that's the case. Trust me, if you look back at the way in which the British state has handled major challenges to its authority, they've never had much of a problem finding class traitors from the working class to leather people, and employing vast numbers of migrants whose first language isn't English to act as your force of repression. That would be a tremendously risky maneuver. If you think about it. First of all, if you want your force of repression to actually retain a degree of credibility with the people that you're repressing. So, for instance, you want your police force, even if it's battering people over their head who are on picket lines, to retain some credibility, to retain the idea that they do so-called policing by consent. If you've now reduced the state forces to being not just a force of a blunt force instrument, but one that is wielded by people who've just literally stepped off the boat, you've basically destroyed the legitimacy of the state in doing so completely. And it wouldn't just be those who are your tools of reaction that would be targeted by the backlash. It would be them. It would be the ruling class themselves. So I've heard that, but again, when you examine it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. The people in the state forces, and this is the risk of Starmer, will continue to be British passport holders of multiple different skin tones. They will be more well rewarded when the state needs them for repression, and they will be people who can be depended upon and can be portrayed as respectable. The idea of crowbarring all the recent arrivals into the police force and using them as a battering ram, I don't think that's particularly realistic, to be honest, comrade. Now, using them, pushing them into the army and sending them overseas, that might be more realistic because the US specializes in that. Jerry asks further, was it you or Jyoti that said that most are here illegally due to finding work after their student visa expired? Yeah, in a lot of cases, like the illegals are there because of are classified as such because of like their status changing and it not getting updated in time. That's certainly a big factor. Going through. Right to buy is mentioned, that's true. Thatcher wrote into law, says Two Sugars, that money couldn't be raised by money raised from council house sales couldn't be used to invest in housing. Yes, that's true. They wanted to kill off the public housing sector. Thatcher, wanted to cut the working class in two, property owners and a new underclass, still living with the mess. Well, the thing is, the so-called property owners these days don't actually own anything. Like you don't own the house that you live in. You know, quite often the bank owns it. You're just the holder of a mortgage, which is going to be a burden around your neck forever. Muzzle Paint joins us. Svetlana says, I spent 3 years in London, interacted with a lot of Russians and Ukrainians there. Every single one of them worked often 2, sometimes 3 jobs. Antti Natso says, I know lots of Eastern European workers sharing a house working 80 hours a week, not one on benefit. Yeah, these are myths that occasionally they'll find somebody who's done it and they'll put them on the front page of the newspaper. Most of the Eastern Europeans, as Antti Natso says, are like people working 2, 3, sometimes 4 jobs to make ends meet. It's like being hyper exploited. That's the reality. Ab Stevens says, I don't think people hate immigrants because of economic factors. It's cultural and identity related. If people can be permanently distracted from their problems, then their problems are trivial. What you've said just makes absolutely no sense. Again, like when you actually go out and talk to working class people who start talking about immigration, the things they mention are the things that Nigel Farage dwells on in his manifesto, in the Reform Manifesto. They talk about wages, they talk about housing, they talk about public services, and they blame all of the problems related to those on immigration. It's not cultural factors. If you actually talk to people, you'll find that some people will go on about British values. Most don't. Most don't. Because most in the inner city working class have lived alongside people of different skin colours and different cultures for years and years and years. And they might have a few odd prejudices, but largely that's not what bothers them. What they bring up to you is class issues distorted through the prism of the migration non-debate. That's what they bring up. So your comment is incorrect. Mass migration was always a fuel for local fascist regime, not the people, says James Goblin. No, mass migration is about profits. It's about finding a workforce that in many cases is hyper exploitable, that will do the jobs, that will do more low wage work, that will help them normalize low wage work. That's why the Germans took in between 750,000 to 1 million Syrians, so they could be employed in the low wage sectors, which have been the main job growth sectors of the German economy over the last 15 years, since the Gerhard Schroeder period. The same is true in Britain. They're brought in for the purposes of profitability. Now, fascist reaction is necessitated when the system tips over into crisis, and then it needs the fascists to come in and re-establish profitability again. It's all about profitability at heart and finding ways to, of course, re-establish it. They'll turn to fascism when they can no longer control the working class. That's when the fascist boots will actually be put on, and they will actually start marching, and they will do it with the full support of the state. They won't turn to fascism whilst they've got all these different liberal alternatives. That's what Nigel Farage is. Nigel Farage is a liberal. It's just a different variety of liberal. Fascism, when it comes, well, it will be rather unmistakable, trust me. What do you see as important factors in the Kent suburbs? Don't know, never been there. Do you let me, I suspect that's a troll comment. Never been there, don't want to either. Kent seems like a ghastly place to me. IRB Fenian says, I think most of those on the active on the left know the immigration isn't the issue. It's the appalling state of housing, healthcare, and union protection for existing jobs. Fertile ground for the right. Yeah, and the right are promoted relentlessly. Like Nigel Farage is the single most promoted politician in the world. Not in the world. That's ridiculous. Sorry. Certainly in the Western world right now, he's promoted relentlessly. The same way Le Pen is promoted in France, or Meloni was promoted in Italy, or Trump was promoted in the United States. These things aren't accidents. These people, I mean, it went a little bit wrong with Trump, but not too wrong. These people are promoted because they are safe repositories for frustration of the working class, but also of the middle class. They know very well that Donald Trump isn't much of a threat. They know that Giorgia Meloni isn't. They know that Marine Le Pen isn't. They know that Alternative for Deutschland aren't. They know that Nigel Farage isn't. But again, they can give the appearance of rebellion. So Nigel Farage had a really good weekend recently. He came out and he said something which was, again, incredibly obvious, that the US and Britain had provoked the war in Ukraine. He'd actually been saying that for 10 years. To be fair to him, he's been consistent in saying that. And of course, he got attacked, screaming headlines from the Daily Telegraph. He's not a patriot. But of course, that's really good for him. The more that these newspapers and these discredited politicians attack him, the better it is for him. because it builds up his image as the great rebel. Now, look at his manifesto, his Reforms Manifesto. You can see it's not too far away from what the Tories are putting forward in all practical terms. You look at his healthcare policy, he's talking about increased use of the private sector. Essentially, it's the same as the Labour Party policy. It's the same as the Tory policy, which is the slow strangulation of public healthcare and the promotion of the private sector. That's what all of their policies actually are, but they just dress it up a little bit differently. Farage, if anything, he's just a little bit more honest. And so an examination of the actual positions of Farage reveals the truth that he's no real threat to capital whatsoever. They just pretend that he is, just as they did when he was in UKIP. Now, it went a little bit wrong for them because they promoted him relentlessly between 2010 and 2015. That backfired on them a little bit because of David Cameron's disastrous miscalculation over Brexit. I mean, winning the 2015 election was really the worst thing that could have happened to the Conservative Party. Had Ed Moribund won, there wouldn't have been the Brexit referendum, and they wouldn't have got themselves into the mess that they're in now. But that just goes to show that the scheming bastards of the bourgeoisie are never fully in control of events. So yes, it helps to promote fake alternatives because the left's connection to the working class either doesn't exist or is very weak, and the left is largely not active in working class areas, with some exceptions, and so. The fake alternatives of the bourgeois and petty bourgeois right wing get promoted by the bourgeois press as a fake rebellion that can be a safe repository for protest votes. Richard, yes, I have noticed that Labour's poll ratings have dipped below 40%. They're not going to do anything like as well as the bourgeoisie want them to. Good afternoon to Comrade Ian Foster, who has joined us. Shanish, we are actually live. How would you respond to the pro-open borders leftists' argument on immigration, asks HM. We have an immigration problem in Brighton of affluent, climate-obsessed liberals coming down from London. You see, that's a real immigration problem right there. Look, it's the same issue but reflected back again. I mean, the way that the soft leftists argue about migration, saying that it's an automatic good. Their argument is as dishonest and naive and utopian, just as the social democrats who argue for restricted borders by capitalist states are going to lead to something good for the working class. What you've got to do is you've got to get people to see things in two ways. First, develop their view of things in two possible ways. Firstly, you've got these soft leftists are often pro-imperialist, or sort of soft pro-imperialists. They're pro like the Ukraine war. They won't be pro the Gaza war, most of them anyway. But a lot of these like pro-EU people are pro-Ukraine war, and largely ignore all the shit that the British government gets up to. Like they've got to go through the process of learning about what British imperialism does and how that leads to large numbers of people from places like Libya and Syria being drained out of their own countries and brought here to be hyper-exploited by British capitalism. Like, why is that a good thing for those workers? Why is it a good thing that their countries get destroyed and they have to flee? Why was it a good thing, from the point of view of the working class, that the socialist states got destroyed and their populations drained away from them and their industries got gutted? And so what, they ended up here serving a coffee to some moron in Brighton? No offense to you, HM. You're obviously a smart person. You're watching this program, but some moron green councillor thinks it's wonderful because a Bulgarian with 2 PhDs served him his cappuccino in the morning. I mean, a lot of the time, these like soft leftist types, they fetishize certain groups of people, but they don't understand the first thing and don't care to understand about why vast numbers of people have been moving around the world, particularly into the imperialist countries over the last 30 years. And that's because largely the imperialist system globally has decimated, either directly or indirectly, their countries, forcing them to move. People don't want to move thousands of miles away from their countries of origin. They're forced to because the opportunities there to support a family are often very limited or non-existent, often by the actions of the imperialist countries themselves. So the cruel irony is they then have to come here to make a living. And that's not a particularly nice system, is it? You know? That's not something that should be celebrated. It's not something that we should tackle via the fake solutions offered by the right wingers and the Social Democrats of supposedly, benefiting the working class by getting immigration restricted by the capitalist state. That's not a solution either. But the soft leftist fetishization of various migrant groups comes from their profound ignorance about imperialism and the fact that they basically just want to put a happy smiley face on the products of imperialism. Corbyn being a useful tool to the ruling elite over the weekend. He always was. Labour could still gain 2/3 of the seats. They still could. I don't think they will. And if they gain like a massive majority on like less than 40% of the vote, it is just basically because the Conservative votes just disappeared. Mary says the British state does bring in reactionary migrants. Yeah, all states do that. If they feel like their position could be bolstered by bringing people in who with reactionary opinions from Ukraine or Hong Kong or Taiwan or wherever, then they'll do that. However, often these people then get tossed into the working class, and then their consciousness will evolve accordingly. Unless they're occupying a very privileged position, that they're not going to stay bitter reactionaries. They're going to be forced to reckon with their class position. As Stalin observed, you might start off with delusions about your class position, but you will be forced to reckon with your real class position before too long. Right, so we are now at 16:33. We have 294 of you watching, 198 on X, and 96 of you on YouTube. So I am going to leave the broadcast there for today. This will be up later on in the day on Patreon. Thanks to all subscribers on Patreon who support the program. Thanks to all those who support via Buy Me a Coffee as well. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in today for a very interesting discussion. As always, I hope you found this informative, and I will be back with you again tomorrow.